Dyer is been generous enough to say that he'll do some office hours where we can just sort of talk to him and, get questions answered and understand his positions on things. So please don't hesitate. Here's a couple little ground rules. Raise your hand if you want to, I know it sounds like school, but raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And then if you're, then Matt will answer, and then we'll go to the next question. And if there's something that you want to add or ask or put into the chat instead, you're welcome to do that. And then I'll ask that question on your behalf. So with that said, let me introduce you to Matt Dyer. Matt, how are you?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. This is the, as Vanita mentioned earlier, inaugural office hours for the 2022 House campaign for me. Jeremy, thank you so much for setting this up and for making sure that we are following through with everything we need to on this, and for inviting people tonight as well. So I don't want to belabor the issues by chatting too much. So please, I'll just open it up. Questions, introductions. I'd love to meet all of you. I think that I may have met Bonnie in 2020, but I don't know for sure. So I will let's start from scratch.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and moderate so that you can focus on your answers. Roberta, we had an opportunity to meet you a little bit. And now Bonnie, I just want to introduce Bonnie because Bonnie is my commissioner of the Board of Assessment Appeals in Woodbury, and she's just a totally wonderful person. But Bonnie, I would ask you to please unmute yourself so that we can hear you, and just to give us a brief sense of who you are and why you've decided to get involved, to hear a little bit about that. Okay, you're still muted, Bonnie. So. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I got it.
Right.
So that's because I'm a retired computer teacher, so I can't do anything anymore. I've been in Woodbury for 34 years, and I'm on the board, the Library Board of Trustees, and I'm also on the Board of Assessment Appeals. And Vanita is a very trusty alternate on that board, so we work closely together. I have become more involved in the Dems lately. Number one, because I do have more time and I'm scared to death. So that is basically it about what the future brings for our country.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie. Natasha and Bernardo, welcome. And if you would unmute yourselves as well so that we can hear a little bit from you guys.
All right, I'm a school teacher in Danbury, and we've been living in Woodbury since 2006. We lived in Woodlake, and then we moved up here to near Flanders. And the last 3-4 years, we participate with Jeremy on Sundays on BLM. And I remember hearing Matt speak one time in the BLM at the Green and Woodbury when you were, I think you were running at the time as well, and you were kind of getting your campaign going.
And Natasha, do you work outside the home, or do you have something that is a passion of yours?
I work on a horse farm, but that's irrelevant.
No, that's time consuming.
When I heard Matt speaking, my sister is a lawyer in New York for kids seeking asylum, and I was very touched by what you said when you spoke in Woodbury, and I have actually in the back of my mind been wishing to somehow support you.
Thank you.
When Jeremy said that, I thought, yay, now we can do something.
Oh, thank you so much. All right. Well, with that said, Jeremy, do you feel that we can get a couple of words from you? Are you willing to introduce yourself? I think everybody might know you, but I'm not sure if everybody does. So just,
I'm happy to, just in case. So my name is Jeremy Farrell. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I have been involved with politics and grassroots activism for the last few years, specifically very involved with Justice Southbury. Right now, I'm helping Matt with his campaign for the 66th District. I'm really happy to be here. I'm helping with a lot of the communications and social media and organization. So when it came to making sure that this Zoom call goes off without a hitch, everybody gets to say what they want to say and stuff, I was just excited to be here and really hear what you guys have to say. To Matt's point, I'm excited to learn more about Woodbury too, and learn it from the people who really know it best.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. So now, Matt, let's go to you. You decided, obviously, to run for office in 2020, and then you came back to be spanked a second time in 22 by the voters and learn from the voters. Why are you running?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for my run, to be honest with you. The probably primary reason for the run is something I mentioned a couple of years ago, and it still retains quite a bit of vitality, which is that I have a certain skill set and I want to serve the community that I'm in. This gives me the ability to try to put a voice into the community that may not be there, that may be there, that's not out there. You know, it may be around, but nobody is saying it. In Woodbury right now, there's a whole group of people who are obviously wanting different things. And quite frankly, their voice is being drowned out by the Row A, faith, freedom, and family group, because they're louder. So I want to serve that community. I want to serve my community. I come from a long line of service, family that are military, that have served. My son is currently serving in the military, so it's sort of in the bones as well. And I think that we have the chance up here now to right the ship a little bit and perhaps get actually some communication across to Hartford in ways that we haven't been able to do that for the last literally 20 years.
So you've said a few times that, you know, the 66th House District, and just so that I can give you guys the town, so that's Litchfield, Woodbury, Warren, Morris, and Bethlehem. And you've said a few times that the 66 doesn't have a seat at the table, doesn't get heard. What do you mean by that?
Well, some years ago, and I don't know exactly when, it was probably when the Republicans became much more of a minority party than they were a few years before that. But ever since the Republicans have become a fairly entrenched minority party, they've taken a tactic of just stonewalling anything that comes from the Democrats. They, in fact, in the municipals in 21, statewide, there were people that were talking about saying no to Hartford, saying no to Hartford, saying no to Hartford. In 2020, David Wilson was talking about it, and so was Craig Minor, just saying no, saying no, saying no. It's been the tactic that the Republicans have taken for a long time. I understand why they take it, but it essentially means that we're throwing a temper tantrum and we're not getting anything done. I talked to a couple of legislators, my first run legislators, my second run so far, and they've all said the same thing, which is if they want to have any bill that needs bipartisan support for anything, they're not coming up here. They're not reaching out to the people that we have in our area to talk about it, to even help with it, which means then if we are sponsoring a bill for any kind, we're also not getting those people to help us. It's just not happening, which means essentially we have nothing. We're not getting any representation. We're talking past each other, and whatever we're trying to say is getting lost in just the no. So that's not what representation is. And as an attorney, and Natasha, I'm sure your sister could corroborate this, as an attorney, I may not like necessarily what's being said, but I have an obligation to represent that. That's my job. So I'll try to, in some ways, change that conversation if I don't think it's right. But at the end of the day, my job is to represent other interests, not my own.
So your law practice features very heavily on this idea of advocacy and helping people who are not getting a fair shake by bureaucracies to be heard, to have the ability to stand up and, you know, to have someone, you know, protect them, to advocate for them. Tell us a little bit more about the law that you practice and some of the things you've learned.
So my practice focuses fairly heavily in litigation. It's broken into about 3 or 4 areas of litigation, but it's all fight, all court, all discussion all the time. My primary bread and butter right now, and has been for the last 20 years, is criminal defense work. Started in the public defender's office at the beginning of my career, left the public defender's office, started my own practice in 2008, and then joined a firm in 2012. I have advocated pretty much for people in litigation scenarios from the beginning. I've done Social Security disability work, which is advocating in an extraordinarily thick federal bureaucracy. The criminal defense world is itself very much a bureaucratic form right now. It's even more so than Fifth Amendment, Fourth Amendment, First Amendment. It's about crossing T's and dotting I's and trying to negotiate and advocate within the context of crossing T's and dotting I's. Essentially, the job has been for 20 years in every angle, trying to guide people from the beginning of a bureaucratic process to the end of a bureaucratic process with as little damage as possible from that bureaucratic process. It's not necessarily an easy road, and it's almost always not an intuitive road, which is part of the reason why we have lawyers to do this. But it's always to try to make sure that people can get from beginning to end without hurting themselves as much as possible.
So you've spoken also about some of the things that are issues that you feel very passionately and strongly about. And you've mentioned healthcare, you've mentioned accessibility to broadband, and you've also mentioned housing accessibility and affordability. Let's talk about healthcare. Tell us what you think, why you're focused on that, and some of the stories you may have heard as you've been campaigning.
Yeah, so healthcare is a huge one right now. Quite frankly, I think financially, healthcare could be the single biggest saving grace economically if we would figure out our way to get a handle on it. The costs of healthcare and the costs of, frankly, higher education have been the only two areas in the economy that have outstripped inflation by double digits over the last, say, 20 years. The cost grows at such a rate that it's now becoming prohibitive. The problem with both of those is they are inelastic demand. The demand is never going to be able to meet up with supply in the traditional neoclassic economics situation, because if I'm about to die, I'm going to pay whatever I need to pay in order to get whatever healthcare is out there. Well, unfortunately, those people who potentially are less scrupulous have capitalized on that, and they continue to raise prices at the end of life. So end of life proceedings in America are ridiculously expensive. If we were able to keep a handle on that, we would be able to, I think, open up some significant economic discretion for virtually every household in the area. For example, I have a constituent who has told me that with premiums and deductibles annually for his family, he has to pay $30,000 every year before he sees an ounce of benefit. One of my partners was paying about $26,000 a year every year before seeing an ounce of benefits. That's in premiums and deductibles. I don't know a single other cost that we have in our society where we pay $25,000 a year without seeing any benefit on that at all. And frankly, with the Obamacare mandate that was repealed, the only thing we did through that was to mandate that we pay that $25,000 a year before we actually see any ounce of benefit. We just forced us to buy something terrible. It would be as if we had to walk into Best Buy and drop $2,000 and then walk out just for, giggles. We aren't getting a benefit from that. So ultimately, we need to figure out how we can get the benefit from that. And I think there are a host of different ways. Some are on the table now, but we have to get a handle on that now, or the next generation has nothing. There's nothing to it.
I'm going to shift to housing accessibility, affordability. I think you mentioned to me that when you were moving to Litchfield, this really became very obvious to you, and I'm sure you've heard more about this. Tell us about your experience moving in, and then some of the things you've heard from the voters you've spoken with.
Yeah, so I think that housing accessibility is, again, key to two primary demographics. The first demographic is families that are moving into a place for their first job, their first home, all this kind of, sometimes they're trying to move back into the place that their families lived after they went off to college. Second, we're talking about seniors who are now on a fixed income, who have enjoyed living in, say, oh, I don't know, Litchfield or Woodbury, who are now being priced out of that for a whole host of reasons, primarily because their housing is so expensive. Connecticut relies extensively on property taxes for its municipal taxation. And the state, frankly, hasn't done much except add the income tax to that burden. As a result of that, we get hit when we're paying because we're working, and then we get hit again when we are at property. Something needs to be adjusted somewhere in there to make sure that we can actually allow people to choose the places they want to live in the places that they choose to live, and to make sure that the choices that are motivating them to be in a community or not being in a community are absolutely not economic decisions, but they are some other type of decision. I want to be in, I don't know, Kent as opposed to Litchfield, or Woodbury as opposed to Southbury, for reasons that have nothing to do with just whether I can or can't economically. In the state 2 years ago, last year they did it and passed some of it. Desegregate Connecticut was talking about ways to make housing more affordable. Unfortunately, as I dug into Desegregate Connecticut, a lot of the pieces of Desegregate Connecticut were already law in a lot of municipalities. In fact, Litchfield just had our annual meeting last week, and two of the issues that were passed as of Desegregate Connecticut regarding accessory housing and parking were already in our planning and zoning. So clearly there's something else that needs to happen, because some of our communities that are still prohibitive are able to get people in or already have those things. When I moved up here, I moved into a condominium up here in Litchfield. If I would have had to get a single family dwelling, I probably wouldn't have been able to move into these areas, because I wouldn't have, number one, necessarily been able to afford it. And number two, and this is really key, I simply wouldn't have been able to find the inventory that would have allowed me to move in here for less than $1 million, just because the inventory simply doesn't exist.
So Bonnie has a question, but before we get to that, I want to follow up on what you said, because I just want to clarify something. So what you're really suggesting, you're not suggesting that everybody should have a 3,000 square foot home and be able to afford that wherever they want to live in Connecticut. What you're suggesting is that there should be some availability if you have $300,000 to spend on a house, that there should be something that you can look at in the geographies in which you want to live.
And I think that, yeah, and the sort of the flip side of that is true to me too, which is that in some ways, I think that as a community, it should be incumbent upon us, rather than letting it go through the market, which is never going to work, because the market is always responsive. It's never proactive. But we need to create housing that's going to allow for people along different economic spectrums to find a place to live here. No, I'm not saying that everybody has to be in a 3,000 square foot house with 16 outbuildings and 5 acres of property and, enough for 3 garages, and that they all should be given a car when they're born and things like that. I'm not suggesting that we should take that burden on ourselves. That's not right. However, if somebody wants to move into a community, they shouldn't be restricted to just 3 acres of property and 3,000 square foot houses. There should be the ability to make duplexes where we have a 1,200 square foot duplex, or I can add on an accessory apartment to an already existing 3,000 square foot house, so I can have an in-law. I can convert a basement into an in-law and not run afoul of zoning issues. I should be able to then, if I want to raise that single family and create a 4-unit multifamily house, I should be able to do that too. And ultimately, we should be trying to incentivize and invest in our futures, which means a whole host of different types of housing, not just relying on the one, and not using housing, frankly, as a means of excluding certain people and making sure that some people don't belong in this community and others do. It shouldn't be an invisible gate, if you will, that keeps people out.
Okay, so Bonnie has a question. Bonnie, I'm going to read your question, and then we may need to ask you for some definition of these acronyms. So Bonnie's question is, Matt, are you familiar with WEP and GPO and the impact on municipal employees, specifically second career teachers in Connecticut? Bonnie, if you would unmute yourself and tell us, what is WEP and GPO for the rest of us who may not know?
So there was a law, and I don't know exactly the year that it was created, sometime in the 1980s, the windfall elimination provision, in which it's now affecting teachers in 15 states, and I believe municipal employees like firemen and police in about 22 states, but don't quote me, where I worked for 20 years, say, and then I taught for 20 years. I am not collecting 100% of my Social Security. So I basically lose like a quarter of my Social Security or a third of my Social Security. Also, government provision offset, when people are married and their spouse passes away, they then collect the higher of the two Social Securities.
Mm-hmm.
I am not permitted to touch my husband's Social Security as a second career teacher in Connecticut.
Oh, this is a very specific second career teacher thing you've
And
hit on.
certain municipal employees in 22 states. There are second career teachers in 15 states. And there have been, and I don't know the names of the bill now, there's something in the House now, but there aren't enough of us, so it keeps getting thrown out.
Okay, so Matt, if you were in the Connecticut House, as we hope that you will be, what would you do to address this kind of issue where there's clearly some kind of inequity here?
Well, the first thing is to recognize a couple of things, which is the limitations of each level of governmental work. The WEP and GPO, if I'm not mistaken, are federal laws that exist around Social Security benefits. And so in many ways, it would be more of the state reacting to what the feds had done back in 1983, more so than trying to proactively fix something that's been done, or more to the point, fix a law that had been passed by Connecticut. So there seems to be an inequity about how the federal law is applying to state residents. And I'll just generally respond to that piece of it, which is that, again, I don't think that inequity should necessarily be there. I would need to see a little bit more data about exactly how it's impacting and how significant that impact is. Number one, I'm a data-driven guy, so I want to make sure that the data reflects effectively what we're feeling. And number two, I'm going to slightly defer the question because, as you mentioned, there is legislation in the House right now that's talking about pension relief, particularly in your types of situations for people who are retired. And that would actually alleviate certain state income tax liability or owage based on whatever the new rules would be. So that if you're in Social Security, if you're in fixed incomes, it minimizes the amount of tax that you would owe in any given situation. So before, I would want to see what the impact of these two plans are and whether they were, number one, intended consequences or unintended consequences, and number two, whether over the course of time that significant that impact has grown, has become more problematic given the lack of increase in teachers' salaries over the course of time from 1983. Is this now having a more of an actual hit than it did in 1983 because the time value of money has increased? So those are the kinds of issues that I would want to sort out and make sure that I hate, just as a general rule, when tax policy is used basically as a political football. I hate when tax policy is used to essentially manipulate various pieces so I can feel like I'm giving my constituents whatever. I think that we need to look at tax policy as an equity thing, exactly what you had just mentioned. I think that we need to make sure that when we are playing with tax policy, that we are knowing who we are actually taking money from, how much, and how fair that is. That's why I'm in favor of progressive tax brackets, tax codes. That's why I'm in favor of relatively simple tax codes. It's why I'm in favor of making sure that once we've passed certain tax policies, that we study the effect of those policies and that we make sure that we are not hammering people who don't deserve, frankly, to be hammered anymore. And frankly, teachers need to stop being hammered. We need to stop using teachers as basically our pin the tail on the donkey kind of people that we're just stabbing pins in wherever we can, So that's just not the way. Teachers are getting just a rough shake of it lately.
Roberta has a question. Roberta, if you would unmute yourself and please ask Matt your question directly.
Sure. Hi, Matt. Well, I'm increasingly concerned with the divisiveness nationally as well as in the state, and even locally here in Woodbury. We've just had a good demonstration of how very divisive the politics are.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to hear your thoughts about that and any possible solutions.
Well, thank you very much for that. First of all, I'm actually going to kick a question back to you first real quick. I've dealt with Help Incorporated for 20 years since I was in the public defender's office. So what exactly were you doing for them?
Well, for the last 16 years, I was executive director.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And
always
program
had-
director and at McAuliffe Manor, which was the women's program in Litchfield,
Yeah.
in the beautiful downtown old Litchfield jail. I established that program and came up from a counselor in training. So spent really my whole career there.
I really had very good luck and great success with Help Incorporated. And I sent clients all over the state, you know, Stonington and down into Danbury, and then of course up into the Danielson area. I've sent clients all over the place for substance abuse. And Help Incorporated was one that I always had some very good success with.
Thank you.
So
Glad to hear it.
thank you. With that in mind, divisiveness is we can do some things about it, but some things we can't do about it. And at a certain point, we're crossing a boundary into appeasement for some pretty nasty ideas and some pretty nasty people. So for me personally, I grew up in Wyoming, which is as red and deep and rural as it gets. There are fewer people in the state of Wyoming than there are Hartford County. Hartford County has roughly double the number of Wyoming. It's not quite, it's about 900,000 to 500,000 people in Wyoming. And Wyoming is about 90,000 square miles. So from tip to stern in Wyoming, if I go from the tip top of the state to the bottom of the state, takes about 6.5 hours to traverse it. It's about 8 hours across from east to west. That means that I can get from basically Hartford past Washington, DC. That's the geographic area that we're dealing with. It's very rural. It's very bad. They are right now, just so we know, they're voting on a couple of things in the state legislature in Wyoming. Number one, they're voting on full ban for abortion. And they are voting to pull gender studies out of the University of Wyoming, which is the only full 4-year full-time institution in the state. So they are trying as hard as they can to get backwards. Some of that we simply can't fight against. It's a foolish place to be. It's intellectually, I think, unsupportable. It's not some place that I ever want to be. And you can't really fight that because it's just not based in logic, reason, or emotion. It's just based on whatever feeling they have going on. So I won't fight that. I won't work on that. But there are other pieces of divisiveness where I think that we actually can have some good say, primarily by recognizing that we all kind of want the same things at the end of the day. Even the people who are really upset about CRT without really knowing what it is, but they're really angry about it, you know, they are really angry about guns being taken away, even though there's been no legislation proposed for that in 100 years. I mean, the last time was what, 2015, when they did the 30 round clip thing. It was right after Sandy Hook. So those people are concerned primarily, I think, about one thing. And a lot of people in rural communities, I think, are concerned about one thing. And that is somebody who doesn't belong to our community is coming in here to say what I should and shouldn't do. They're telling me rules that I have to follow, but they don't know anything about how we behave up here. They don't know anything about how Woodbury lives. They don't know anything about how Litchfield lives. You know, you want to have a city dweller come into the country up here and tell me how I need to live. I got a whole different thing. I'm worried about farms. I'm worried about farm equipment. I'm worried about being outside. I don't have any time for you city dwellers kind of a thing. And so there is that very real, I don't want people telling me what to do feeling. That we can address, because at the same time, we all want certain things. We want to make sure that we're all part of the same team. We want to make sure that we have enough money and resources to manage our own affairs appropriately. And sometimes that money comes through taxation and through other people. So we try to find ways to talk about those things. That's what legislation is. That's what we do up in Hartford. That's the whole purpose of it, is to basically figure out, when we collect our resources together through taxation, how do we distribute that outwards? How do we get that back to the people that are there? Because sometimes collecting 5 cents from everybody is a heck of a lot more efficient than trying to raise $10 million.
Matt, I just want to circle back though to the divisiveness question,
Sure.
because I think that what I've heard you say in the past before is, and please, speak more to this, the part about it serves purposes to divide us, and we need to spend more time thinking about what unites us. And I think that, talk a little bit more about that and some of the things that you might do.
Sure. Again, so in targeting the things, and Vanita's right, there's much more up here in this community that unites us than divides us. We choose to focus on the things that are divisive. They're more dramatic and more fun, I guess. But if in some ways, even the invasion in Ukraine, almost instantaneously, we're all on the same team. And we were all very much behind each other. There were a few people like Trump who were clamoring for Putin and calling him a genius, things like that. But even the guys who had been sort of doing that, like Tucker Carlson, sort of started to back away. So we do have a lot more unifying feeling, I think, than all of that. So the question is, what do we do with that? My thoughts about that is basically to try to think in Woodbury as locally as possible. Same thing with Litchfield. How do we keep our targeted goals, things that Bonnie just raised, with WEP and GPO and taxes? How do we make sure that people who are on fixed incomes aren't getting hammered even further, so that they have to go to someplace else, West Virginia or New York or something else? How do we make sure that we keep people who have loved Connecticut in Connecticut? How do we find ways to basically say, if you're going to be here and you choose to be here, then you need to? Well, that's keeping it local. I want to make sure that we work on streets. I want to make sure we work on stop signs. I want to make sure we work on making sure that, Bethlehem and Woodbury and Litchfield, not Litchfield so much anymore, but are all getting the same kind of share of education costs, that we're not just burying one group at the expense of the other. So all of those things are things that hit right at home. They're right here. They're the things that I like to call the pothole problems. That, I think, is the way to get past divisiveness and say, you know what, I really don't care what you think about CRT. I'm glad that we got that pothole fixed out in front of your house so that you're not tripping over it every time you walk out. Those are the kinds of ways that we can talk through and around divisiveness.
I'd like to switch topics a little bit and talk about your belief in Black Lives Matters, both the concept and then some of the ways that you lived that in your life. Bernardo mentioned that was one of the first opportunities I think he had to meet you. Tell us a little bit about why you've invested some personal time in that.
Yeah, I can give a couple of stories about why somehow coming up from Wyoming, where you'd expect in some ways that racism would be written large on my forehead, which is probably true, I guess. I guess we all are to a little degree at one or another. What's the song in Avenue Q? Everyone's a little bit racist, So the question that I have about racism is not always about distinction. It's not always about making sure that we try to eradicate distinctions or eradicate differences or anything of that nature. It's about fundamental, the fundamental dignity of every human being. And that doesn't change whether you're any color. It makes no difference. We have systemic issues that have been created over the course of the last 150, 200, 300 years that simply are built into the bones of what we do. The law was created at a time where we were very racist. We were, so racist that we had 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. You can't say that somehow just building on that same foundation that it's not corrupted. It's corrupted. It was a terrible idea then, it's a terrible idea now. We need to eradicate that. That's got to be fixed. Systemically, that's got to be fixed. Redlining in the 50s. It's not something that if you basically say we're creating various places for people to live, that 2 to 3 generations down the road, we can say, I know that stunk and that was really terrible, but get over it and just move on. It's not, we have to eradicate those foundation building blocks. You can't build off of a cancerous building block. It's cancerous. You need to get rid of that part and start with healthy flesh. We are not starting with healthy flesh, and we continue to fight over the idea of healthy flesh. Personally, for me, when I was a kid, I think I was in second grade, maybe. My best friend was a guy named Lerone Young. He was probably the only black guy in town. It's not quite right. There were three. And so his dad worked with my dad. On one Saturday, I remember going to a family reunion for Lerone and his family. And I went to Washington Park in Casper, Wyoming, and there was a sea of black faces. And I was the only white kid around, you know what I'm saying? And I'm like, holy cow. And I didn't think about it in exactly these terms then, but I thought about it a lot since then, which is that in many ways, for a society where you're the minority, that's the feeling all the time. And you have to learn how to fight that or face it, or just in some ways compartmentalize that feeling of difference in order to try to fit in. And that, to me, I think is problematic. Instead of trying to find ways to say that society needs to erase all of those distinctions, I think we need to celebrate those distinctions within each other and find ways to say that because of the historical destruction based on those distinctions, we need to move forward. There are so many stories, and I love reading them, that are coming out now finally about how even in the 40s, even in 1860s, even in the 1820s, there were people of all races and all creeds and all genders and all types that were doing things. We've just forgotten. We've moved on and said that somehow a white guy was the only one that did this thing, and we've celebrated.
Ida B. Wells in our discussion, right? Where are some, these folks that were real, trailblazers? Yeah,
absolutely. And so it's nice to see that we are actually getting some of those voices in, but we have actively worked to eradicate voices, and we need to stop doing that. Those stories are not being told. Legislatively, we have got to stop building off of those poisonous foundations. They're destructive. They're rotted. If the house foundation was rotted in your home, you would replace the foundation. You jack the house up and you replace the foundation. It would potentially still be a strong house, but you've got to jack the house up. We have to be willing to be that destructive in many ways to some of these racist ideas and to some of the policies that have been based on them.
So I would just request everybody who's on this Zoom call, please don't post that, Dyer says jack the house up without the context.
Good point. Yeah, that's
going to come across really weird.
I literally mean with a jack. That's not a metaphor.